Welcome to the Gravity Well podcast with me, Jenny Araby. I host the Gravity Well to celebrate and share the stories of the people empowering others with knowledge, skills, and plans required to reestablish stability in our communities. Your mission is to work through these heavy issues with me in order to lighten the load. I acknowledge that I live on the traditional territories of Treaty 7 and Métis Districts 5 and 6. The treaties and self-governance agreements established by Indigenous peoples were created to honor the laws of the land, maintain balance with nature, and give back to uphold reciprocal relationships. This knowledge and intention are what guide the Gravity Well conversations. I ask for genuine dialogue, real hearts, and openness to different perspectives. This is your invitation to find common ground with me. Positions taken by participants, either individually or collectively, do not necessarily represent those of the Gravity Well. This podcast is dedicated to the natural world, our children, nieces, nephews, grandchildren, and all future generations. The Gravity Well is on YouTube, Substack, and streaming wherever you get your podcasts. If you like what you see and hear, remember to like and subscribe. We are talking about the legal system and the water market today. We have two guests with us, Arlene Wozniak, who's a professor emeritus of law with the University of Calgary Law Faculty.
Yeah, Arlene Wozniak, as you said, professor emeritus of law, faculty of law. I'm also adjunct with environmental design and senior research fellow of the Canadian Institute of Resources Law. And I've been involved with water law for several years, I guess, since taking water law from David Percy back in 1979 or so. And I think he really got my interest going, and it's been kept on since then. And I've been publishing and doing what I can to help sustainable water use and aquatic ecosystem protection.
Thank you so much for your work, Arlene. Really excited to hear more about it. And Davin McIntosh, who practices planning and municipal law for several years before facilitating water transfers.
Davin McIntosh, the owner of Water Transfer Alberta. I guess my interest in the space started when I was doing my undergrad law degree, and people like Arlene and Nigel Banks at University of Calgary inspired me to learn more about the area. I went on to have a career as a planning and municipal development lawyer at a couple of Alberta's biggest firms, where many of my clients were developers or municipalities, and had questions about the evolving framework for water rights in the province. And so seeing that as an opportunity, I went back to U of C and did a master's in working with Arlene. So a pleasure to be here with Arlene today, and started Water Transfer Alberta in 2007. Since then, I've been consultancy and a broker for water rights, and I've been involved in a significant proportion of the water transfers that have happened in the Bow River Basin and also many in southern Alberta.
My name's Bob Morrison, and I'm a retired planner. Originally worked in water management and transportation planning. Since retirement, I've been involved in municipal issues. And my main concern is getting people to understand water and how important it is in their lives.
Yeah, so excited to hear more about this area, a space where people are not really clear on how this all goes down in our province. So very excited. Okay, but we're going to start with you, Arlene. Arlene has prepared a presentation for us. So let's get going on it, please.
I was asked to talk about laws that affect and regulate water and water use in Alberta. And there are tons of them. I think we start with the Constitution of Canada, which divides legislative powers, who can regulate what. And you'll see that there are lots of federal powers that can deal with water issues such as fisheries, some pollution that can harm fisheries, migratory birds, navigation, navigable rivers, water in bed and shores on federal lands, as well as Indigenous lands, intraprovincial and international water, species at risk. We can't discount that there's a lot of federal interest, though I won't be talking about that today. And then provincial laws can regulate water as a provincial property, and I think that's the main constitutional basis that I'll be talking about. So water use rights, pollution, water bodies and bed and shores, environmental matters, municipalities, things like fishing limits. And then you have and then the Constitution, of course, recognizes and affirms existing Aboriginal rights and treaty rights. And so there's a whole body of Indigenous water law And we constantly are trying to determine the extent of Indigenous water rights, but I have no doubt that they exist. And then there's federal and provincial statutes that are made according to these constitutional division of powers. There's the Indigenous law and the common law, which I'll talk about a little bit, international law. Then there are policies, which are something less than law, but governments make and can be very important with how we manage water and water rights. I'm going to mainly focus on water use management and water rights, primarily under Alberta water legislation. But before I start, I just want to say, what if we could just invent a water law out of the blue without having anything else to worry about? What would we do? We would invent a water management system where we wouldn't let particular water rights holder to inordinately impact private or public interests, such as, impairing in any significant ways any aquatic ecosystems. So you need mechanisms in the law to curb, cancel, and expropriate diversion rights in the public interest. You also need to secure sufficient in-stream flow to make sure that you have water systems that will even accommodate human diversions. You need secure water for drinking, washing, and other basic human needs. You'd regulate quantity and quality. That just makes sense because, of course, pollution assimilation depends upon the amount of water one is dealing with. You'd have something called conjunctive use, where you'd regulate both groundwater and surface water together because they do form a system. You'd have incorporate watershed governance and management. And so you would not just regulate the water in a water course or a water body, but also bring in the water uses on the land because they can affect what's in the water body. You clarify rules regarding alternative sources because water that we can use doesn't just come from rivers and lakes, also comes from wastewater reuse, rainwater, stormwater, and saline water, which I don't have down here, but it's also very important to the oil and gas industry. And you would incorporate climate change mitigation and adaptation plans and actions because this is not only inevitable, but happening and impacting our water resources. What is the background to our water law? And at the end, if I have time, I'll go through those things I just mentioned to see how our water law measures up. Okay, so prior to water management and use right legislation in Western Canada, common law riparian rights applied. And this is common law, court-made law, and under it, only occupants of riparian land that is directly adjacent to a river or a water course or a water body, had the right to divert and use water. And they also had the right to the continued flow. All riparians were subject to that limitation. And there were like two basic riparian rights: the household use, which was very limited to things like drinking water, washing clothes, really a household would need. And an extraordinary use could include commercial uses, but all the uses must be reasonable and leave the water source undiminished in quality and quantity. So there was built-in equity for riparians and sustainability limits because each riparian had the same right. And so if someone was violating someone else's riparian right, they could go to court to try to enforce it. But riparian rights weren't really working in Alberta, late 1800s, called the Northwest Territories. And so the Dominion at that time passed a legislation that was called the Northwest Irrigation Act. I mean, in the dry prairies, there weren't really that many riparians. And this act extinguished all riparian rights except for the household right, which was then quantified in the legislation, and a couple other riparian rights which still exist, such as the right to land that accretes to your property in a slow and perceptible way. And there are still some modified access rights to the water body or water course. Next slide. So the Northwest Irrigation Act, and in subsequent legislation, the way it works is that the Crown claims ownership of all the water in the province and the right to divert, use, and generally disturb it. And so since it claims it owns it, it can then give that right to people who apply for it to divert, use, or disturb water through legislation. And the way that's done is through statutory authorization. And I should mention that the Crown also claims ownership of the bed and shores of rivers and other watercourses, lakes, and permanent naturally occurring water bodies, but that's under a different set of legislation. Most water rights, beginning with the Northwest Irrigation Act, are based on the principle of prior allocation, known as first in time, first in right. You don't have to be a riparian owner to get a fit for right. Priority, or the right to divert, is based on the date of the application for a water license. And what that means that in times of shortage, the most senior gets all of their allocation before any less senior has the right to any water. And I like to use the following analogy. How this would work with water is like if you have Joe who got his water license 100 acre feet. That's how they were measured back then, the amount of water needed to fill an acre of land in 1900, and then Sally 50 in 1946 and Mary in 1988. And these licenses run with the land. And so even though Joe's not with us, whoever who owns that land would have that right, could get all his 100 acre feet, even though it might be downstream from Sally or Mary, for Sally or Mary have the right to any of it. It's sort of like if we had a family food supplement supply entitlement rules where the oldest person gets as much food as they need, as might have been determined at some time. And then the next oldest gets to fill their food needs and then follow the same pattern until the family runs out of food. So here be Grandpa Joe gets to eat everything he wants, and then what's ever left goes to Sister Sal, then to Mom Sue, and then to Dad Doug, then to Mom Sue, and then to Baby Bev. What can happen in a time of shortage is the most junior entitlement holder, nothing at all. So we have to ask ourselves right now, is this really a reasonable way to allocate water? So the Northwest Irrigation Act was law until the transfer of public lands and natural resources from the Dominion to the Prairie Provinces in 1930. As you might recall, the Dominion held those public lands and natural resources back from the Prairie Provinces when they became provinces. And then Alberta then had to pass its own legislation, which it did with the Water Resources Act in 1931, and that only applied to surface water as in the Northwest Irrigation Act. And then Water Resources Act added groundwater to the Crown-owned water. All of a sudden it said, we own groundwater as well in 1962. And before that, the rule of capture applied at common law, where the owner could just take as much as they wanted and the heck with any other groundwater users. But then it was now subject to, the groundwater was subject to prior allocation and FITFR, just like surface water. And then the Water Act replaced the Water Resources Act in 1999 when it was declared into effect. And FITFR was carried forward in the Water Resources Act and in the Water Act. And I can tell you there was discussion on whether it should be, because I was a member of the Water Management Review Committee that gave their recommendations to the province in enacting the Water Act. And there was a lot of discussion, although the main water users certainly won the day. So what the act does that's different from the Water Resources Act is, I guess, first thing it does is it divides the province into what are called major river basins. This is just a map of it. And I just want to mention that there is I guess I can call it a consultation, although the government calls it an engagement on water availability, because the government is going to be amending the Water Act in various ways. And I have it here as Alberta Water Availability Engagement Survey, which anyone can fill out online until June 30th. One thing it wants to do is to merge the Peace, Slave, and Athabasca basins. That certainly will have consequences for water law and water transfers and maybe other things as well. Another major change is it brought in planning requirements and mechanisms, and most significant are what are called approved water management plans, because these must be considered in some important regulatory actions under the Water Act, such as transfers. And there are only 3, as far as I know, right now: the South Saskatchewan River Basin Approved Water Management Plan, Battle River Approved Water Management Plan and the Milk River Approved Water Management Plan Phase 1. There's lots of other water management plans, but they aren't approved by cabinet, and so they don't have the same regulatory impact and effect. In the Water Act, how does one get a water right? Well, there are statutory authorizations. The first one is an exemption. I think it's a regulatory right, but it means you don't have to do anything more to acquire it. So there are specific exemptions in the regulations for fire control and things like that. But the main ones are the household use exemption, which pretty much brings forward the household use riparian right, but quantifies it to 1,250 cubic meters a year. And it only applies to riparian, but also groundwater users. Then there are agricultural use exemptions for traditional agricultural uses up to 6,250 cubic meters a year. So this is things like raising cattle and having dugouts. Here I have the water availability survey noted because the government is proposing to increase the number of exemptions and also the quantity of water that is exempted. Or you could acquire a regulatory right such as a license or an approval. Yeah, licenses are the main ones that we talk about today because they give the right to divert a quantity of water for an authorized purpose, typically for a 10-year renewable term. Under the Water Resources Act and predecessor legislation, there was no term, and so the existing licenses, the ones that still exist, don't expire. Water licenses are, I understand, quite easily renewed. So the purposes are set out in the regulations, so the government has the right to change purposes without amending the statute. I'm not going to go through them all, but as you can see, they're, as one could expect, municipal, agriculture, irrigation, commercial, and so on and so forth. But then some kind of interesting ones like habitat enhancement, recreation, implementing a water conservation objective, which I'll talk about a little bit. And then any other purpose specified by the director has seemed to have fallen off this. So the director can just, get an application for a water license and I guess just identify a purpose that can be a purpose for a water license. So this is an old slide, but it does show you who the main water users are. So we have agriculture being the largest, commercial, and then oil and gas, then other uses, and municipal. Some points on the Water Act licenses compared with pre-Water Act licenses, what are called the existing licenses, is they can have water conservation objective conditions. That means that the director under the Water Act who's issuing the license can require what are basically minimum flow conditions, that if the water source does not meet certain minimum flows, then the director has the right to cut back on the amount of water that the license holder can divert as determined by the water conservation objective, like how much water does the government want left in the water course. I just want to mention and compare these to in-stream objectives. That's the term that was used for minimum flows prior to the Water Act. And so on the existing licenses, you might have in-stream objectives, which also give the director the right to cut back on the allocation if the in-stream objective isn't met. But it could be quantified in a different way from the water conservation objectives and is usually less as far as we can ascertain. But also compare both WCOs and IOs to in-stream flow needs, because in-stream flow needs are scientifically determined quantity and quality of water that is needed to protect aquatic ecosystems. And this is a scientifically determined amount, and as opposed to more of a politically determined amount with the WCOs and the in-stream objectives, which are, okay, they may govern what the water course needs, the in-stream flow needs, but then, just take some number between that and nothing and make that as the WCO or the IO to enable as much allocation as it wants. So the pre-Water Act licenses, the existing licenses, are really greatly protected under the Water Act. And in that, if the terms and conditions of existing water licenses are inconsistent with anything in the Water Act, the terms and conditions apply, which is pretty amazing to me. And new water licenses can be modified subject to some certain limitations, including because of aquatic ecological conditions, and some with compensation payable. But this does not apply to existing licenses. And new water licenses can be transferred in regulated and limited situations, and Davin will be talking about that. I have WAES written in a couple places here because the government proposes amendments which will alter what I say here. So back to the obvious points. This was a really brief overview. So how does the Water Act measure up? Okay, with respect to not permitting water right holders to inordinately impact public and private interests in water, well, they curb in part, at least for new water licenses, but existing water licenses, there's not much government can do about them. But there's no expropriation power, which I think is quite amazing, since government can expropriate private land and water rights are not even property interests. Cancellation power is very limited, only if the water right has not been used for 3 years and there's no reasonable possibility that it will be used. Securing sufficient in-stream flow, well, there are a few tools in the Act, but they are really quite limited. Recognizing Indigenous water rights and securing water for them, the Act does not do that. Securing water for drinking, washing, and other basic human needs, household use right does have the highest priority, so it does that at least in part. Regulating water with quantity and quality, no, the Act doesn't do that. Conjunctive use, groundwater, surface water, I think maybe government tries to do that when it's consistent with but there's no requirement. Incorporating watershed governance and management, certainly not formally, although there are all kinds of things like watershed organizations that work towards this. Clarifying rules regarding alternative sources, wastewater, so on, rainwater, and so on. No, but the government plans to add these into the Water Act. Incorporating climate change and mitigation adaptation. Sorry, it does not do that. That's the end.
So would you give it an A, B, C, or D?
B or the?
Please give us is it a pass? Would you pass this act? Is this something that you feel is sufficient?
No, absolutely not. No. I think it certainly did a few things over the Water Resources Act, which are good, but it could have done a lot more. It could have just done it's been done at other places in Saskatchewan, Australia, New Zealand, and have more equitable way of distributing water. And I think it probably could do it with respect to water management as generally. But honestly, I know from being on the Water Management Review Committee that the really powerful sectors, oil and gas, municipalities, and agriculture just wouldn't have it. FITFR is pretty solidly in there. It's not going anywhere.
I have so many questions, but I'm going to ask one out of the gates, which is, I loved your diagram of showing Joe have his senior license and that comes first. I don't understand how that works in a geography sense. So meaning if you have somebody down in the irrigation district that has a senior license, presuming that that's true, how would somebody who has a junior license in the headwaters know that there's not enough allocation for them to receive their license? I'm just wondering in real time, how would that decision be made?
Well, I understand it's done in conjunction with Alberta Environment, and they will let you know when you can have your water. Is that how you understand it, Davin?
Yeah, well, I think the long and the short of it is it's rarely, if ever, being done. Priority calls have rarely happened in the basin, despite that it's the cornerstone of the Act. And Alberta has, of course, taken on lots of initiatives to avoid priority calls, anticipating shortages. We saw last year big multi-stakeholder negotiations to get voluntary reductions so that a priority call wouldn't happen. And if you think about the risk of a priority call, many of the more junior licenses, if you go back to Arlene's slide, which showed how the relative proportion of uses, municipal uses are growing, and most of the rest are staying more stable. So many of those more junior licenses are held by municipalities or municipal purposes. You can't cut off people's drinking water.
Right. That's the one thing I heard that is protected in the act primarily is household use, you were saying. Is that right?
Yes.
Household use generally, but licenses issued to municipalities do come with a priority and are, prima facie subject to time, person, right, just like every other license.
If you're not a riparian and you get your water from the municipality, you're getting the water is as good as the municipality's priority. Though, as Davin says, there really hasn't been a call, so you don't have to worry about it very much.
Right.
In terms of the groundwater, can they apply FITFR to groundwater? But if an irrigation district wanted to make a call on their priority, would they be able to go after groundwater people as well?
I don't see why not. I mean, especially if the groundwater is connected to the surface water, and I don't really know technically how that would work.
Okay, so it would have to be connected to the system. It wouldn't be fossil water that is not connected to the river system anymore.
Generally speaking, in the water regime, there's a pretty big separation between surface water and groundwater, and the Water Act, focuses on surface water. Typically, you don't see groundwater serving larger users because the amount of water you can get out of a well is pretty limited unless you're lucky enough to sit over a giant aquifer that isn't connected to the river to surface water. Because, if you have a well that's near a river and it's seen as connected, then technically you need a surface water license, even though you're taking the water out of the ground.
That's right. And then it would just be subject to all the surface water priorities.
Well, that leads to another question I have. TransAlta has on the Bow system their hydroelectric plants. And those originally came in under, the Dominion Water Power Act? And then they somehow got into the Water Resources Act. And then back in the 1980s, I think, the provincial government said, okay, TransAlta, you're now part of the priority system, which apparently maybe they weren't before that. Has anybody ever analyzed that to see if TransAlta had some sort of special rights in terms of FITFR?
I don't know how much it would be worth considering because, as you said, their rights are among the oldest in the province. If they did, they would have effectively first priority anyway. In the end, it's kind of a moot point. But there have been negotiations between TransAlta and municipalities over the years about how to deal with water shortages and flood and all kinds of other things. And TransAlta does hold a lot of potential power in the system.
Yeah, that's the reason I was asking, is because every time things start to get tight, whether it's flood management or management during a drought, people tend to look at TransAlta and say, can you help us out? And I was wondering how they potentially may not fit into the system, or maybe they're completely in the system like everybody else.
It's my understanding that they are in the system like everybody else. At times, they've explored opportunities to kind of wield that power or, monetize some of their interests. And at other times, they've kind of wanted to help and collaborate with municipalities and other big users.
Right. We're hoping to have a conversation with TransAlta at some point in this series.
You mentioned in-stream flow needs and how that can be scientifically quantified or substantiated, let's say. I'm curious, again, in terms of execution, being a scientist and wondering about how would that be enforced? Again, thinking about a river and its needs, significant potential water shortages on the landscape. How would the rights of nature, let's say, be enforced through the Water Act, or would it be is it a federal question? I'm just curious how that would actually be enforced.
Whether it's a federal thing, curiously, I had another student who Davin knows, Maureen Bell, who wrote a thesis on that. And she argued it could be, though I don't think the federal government has acknowledged it, and certainly the province hasn't. But it's the way IFN's in-stream flow needs could be enforced would it be only to the extent that the Water Act recognizes them and has some sort of law that requires that they be enforced. And right now, they're not. There is WCO, which could be enforced in the water conservation objectives, can be enforced with respect to particular licenses. and in-stream objectives. But as far as I have been able to ascertain, and I rely on others to do the science here, that IO and WCO is not the same as, is less than IFN. And so you can maybe protect some of the water, but not all. And there's also possibility of government WCO licenses. So the government could give itself a license to protect WCO, which I understand it has done. And then that water is presumably protected. But there are no private in-stream flow licenses. You can't get a license under the Act just to protect in-stream flow, or at least we tried. And Davin and I and Maureen Bell tried, but were not successful. And so that's, on the WAES, the Water Availability Survey, you might, if people are interested, they might want to ask the government to amend the Act to clarify that you can have in-stream flow licenses, because I think that would go a long way, or at least a part of the way, to protect in-stream flow.
I think big picture, and one of Arlene's criticisms of the Act is that it isn't very adaptive. When there's less water in the province, there's not necessarily less use. We see the tools that the government does have as pretty limited. I think generally there was a line of thinking that was that nowhere should more than approximately 50% of natural flows be allocated under licenses. And that was the motivation, the impetus for the moratorium on issuing new licenses in the South Saskatchewan River Basin and other parts of the province. And so the remainder is allocated under licenses. And then you see terms and conditions in licenses. Every license is different. And you see these water conservation objective conditions that say, thou shalt not divert if the water is below a certain level at a certain station. Unfortunately, that's really difficult to police when you've got, thousands of licenses out there. It's really self-regulated for the most part. And it takes some sophisticated analysis, which, I think probably the big users, the irrigation districts, the larger municipalities are doing a pretty good job of making sure that their use corresponds to the terms and conditions of their licenses. But for smaller users who would have to go and calculate the in-stream flows at a couple of stations over time and, decide whether they can irrigate tonight or not, it might be much more difficult. And I expect that in practice, not many farmers are doing that, not many private license holders.
Arlene, in terms of in-stream flow needs, you mentioned the federal powers, the Navigable Waters Protection Act, in particular the Fisheries Act. How has that played into the management of water in Alberta?
It really hasn't. I mean, there are people need Fisheries Act authorizations if they're going to be carrying out some project that will impact fish habitat. I mean, so it has played out that way. But as far as, focusing on in-stream flow needs, I mean, there was one case from, I don't even remember when, the 70s or so, where I believe maybe Davin can remember this. I think it was a irrigation district or a small irrigator, or maybe it was a private irrigator, was cut off by the federal government because they were using too much water and fish habitat was being impacted. But then there was a big kerfuffle over that, and the federal government just withdrew from that action. And I haven't heard anything about that since. And I mean, so the federal legislation is mainly approvals, to do things that will impair navigation or impair fisheries. And although, as I said, Maureen Bell, who's also a lawyer practicing in the water transfer area, I think to some degree, argued that the federal government has power to enforce in-stream flow needs insofar as they might impact navigation or fish habitat, hasn't been enforcing those powers.
I was looking at the Water Act last night, not that I'm a legislation junkie, but I remembered a clause that was in there from some other time. And it says very early on in the Act, the Crown is bound by the Act. That seemed odd to me because I'm not a legislation junkie. I don't recall ever seeing something like the traffic laws or anything like that. Is there some particular reason why that ended up in the Water Act?
I think it's pretty common. Maybe it's because it had to be clearly said. In natural resources type legislation, I think it's a fairly common that the Crown is bound by its own legislation.
It would put in the legislation specifically, the Crown is bound by the Act, because Being an ordinary citizen, I would assume Crown's bound by anything else, just like us, but maybe not.
Oh, you mean that it doesn't have to be said?
Not being a legal expert, I would assume the government can't just make its own law and then say it doesn't apply to us.
Well, sometimes it does. I mean, sometimes it'll specifically say it's not bound, or it's not bound by certain provisions. Standard is that the Crown is bound by its own legislation.
Okay, just take that as a dumb question from an illegal dummy.
That is a good question.
Yeah, exactly. I didn't know that.
As an example, I mean, you see the Crown holding water licenses and being bound by their terms and conditions. And when they don't have them, they go and get them. So the Alberta Environment has been a participant in the system and even a potential purchaser of water rights in some circumstances.
Wow. Okay, so if that isn't complicated enough, now let's talk about water transfers. Can you please help us understand, Davin, the water transfer process, how that works in Alberta, please?
Stepping back again, big picture, why do we have the transfer provisions? And it goes back to the rights were issued for over 100 years, most without any expiry date. Along the way, I guess it was in the 80s and 90s, there was a recognition that if all those rights were exercised at once, that many of Alberta's rivers and streams would be below environmentally sustainable levels, could have disastrous consequences for wildlife, habitat, drought, all those sort of things. So along came the New Water Act and included provisions that would allow for the transfer of water licenses. And then slightly later, along with the implementation of the South Saskatchewan, or with the approved water management plans generally, and then an order, we had a moratorium in 2007, which stopped the issuance of new water licenses in many areas of the province. That was when the transfer provisions, which were in the Act from earlier, actually came into effect. So the transfer system, it's not as simple as it first appears. I've been facilitating transfers for more than 18 years now, and I still get surprised frequently. It looks pretty simple on paper. You can go online and find the process spelled out in 4 or 5 steps. But I've seen lots of consultants who try to work through it, and not many have stuck with it over the years. I'd say there are basically 8 steps to the transfer process. First is finding a suitable right. It's not easy to find rights. People don't generally post them for sale. There are provisions in the Act that say if you don't have a current use for your water, they're subject to cancellation. As Arlene said, that's rarely happened, but if rights haven't been used for 3 years or more and there's no reasonable prospect of use, licenses can be canceled. And so going and advertising that you got water rights for sale sometimes is seen as a red flag. Maybe I don't need it anymore. Maybe I haven't been using it. You don't typically see that, so it can be difficult to find a suitable right. I tell my clients it's a bit like arranging a marriage in some ways, because what the seller sells and what the buyer gets may be quite different. And the engagement will end badly if transfer is refused. Arranging a transfer, you really have to consider and anticipate the analysis that the director will make after an application is submitted. It's sort of like a mini environmental review process that happens between the application from the buyer and seller to the transfer being approved. So yeah, step 1, finding a suitable right, and then you got to negotiate a purchase price, because someone has to give their right up, and that doesn't generally happen for free. That's where the legal aspect and the business aspect comes in. And contracting for, as I said, you're not buying and selling a physical thing that necessarily comes out the other end the same, and there's no certainty that transfer will be allowed. So it can be a little bit mired coming up with reasonable contractual terms, because if both participants, both the seller and the buyer, don't cooperate through the process of the review, then it'll never be approved. I remember a time back in 2009 or 10, and I spoke to the approvals manager and I said, how many transfer applications have been refused? And at the time he said, well, none. And I said, how many have you had? He said, well, 50 or some. But we've only had a handful that have been determined to be complete. You submit an application, and then that gets to step 2, confirming it's in good standing, and step 3, which is requests for further information. The director has a lot of discretion to ask for additional information before deeming an application complete. In many cases, you see applications submitted, but they're never deemed complete. So they're never formally refused, but they're never approved either. So yeah, step 2, you got to confirm a license is in good standing. That is a condition precedent to consideration of a transfer application. The approvals manager or the compliance group will look at a license and say, have there been any identification of any non-compliance issues? Has it been used? Has it been reported on? Do the works match the plans on file? All that sort of stuff. And sometimes that can take a lot of time. I had a license transfer a few years ago, and it was a little private irrigation canal, and it had changed over the 100 years or so that the license had been issued. The check structures were in slightly different places, or they didn't look exactly as they did in the original plan. They'd still been using it and reporting it, and so it wasn't really not in good standing, but it didn't match the plan. Interestingly, Alberta Environment said, well, go fix it all, go make it match the plan, and then we'll consider a transfer. So, all this money and time was spent rebuilding works so that they could be retired a few months later. That happens quite frequently. So yeah, then there's a paper application. The paper application looks pretty simple. Buyer and seller sign that they're in agreement and how much of the allocation is going to be transferred and what rate of diversion is going to be transferred. And then come the requests for information from the director. Historically, there's not much in the Act that limits what the director can ask for. Tremendous amount of discretion to ask for very specific detail or very general detail. And this has been a challenge, especially in light of all kinds of, I could say, policies. I mean, the director's consideration is supposed to focus around two basic heads of consideration, which is the effect on the aquatic environment and other water users. And that doesn't give much guidance on what exactly the director should look at in deciding whether a transfer should be approved or denied. And you get transfer applications to go from one side of the province to the other, or from a big river to a little creek, or vice versa. And so there's all kinds of ways that you could look at the impact on the environment and other users of those proposed transfers. And there hasn't been much bounding that. What we've seen is, a host of policies, administrative policies, but unwritten, generally not, you can't find them anywhere, a list of how these things are all considered. So, that's really been core of my, the value I added in a lot of cases to transfers is just, understanding how different directors think sometimes, but also how those policies are evolving, how those considerations are evolving and being implemented. We've seen all kinds of policies that get discussed. Some of them do get documented at some point. Like, a few years ago, they stopped allowing transfers that went around a corner, like from one side of a Y, a tributary to another, because of the lack of apparent connectivity between the flow of the water. Apportionment is another policy that has been discussed a lot. What that means is when you're transferring a right from a bigger river to a smaller tributary, you can only move the percentage that tributary contributes to that bigger river upstream to the tributary. And that really changed the system and changed prices and changed what was being approved. And that kind of was phased in over time, just, ideas and considerations of a couple of different directors and others at Alberta Environment. See other things like good standing. Once or twice I've seen a license be determined to be in good standing, but only part of it's in good standing, not all of it. That was an interesting one. So, and then we've seen lots of back and forth on the issue of whether to impose the conservation holdback. The Water Act allows for a 10% conservation holdback, 10% of every license transfer to be issued as a water conservation objective license to the government. For a while, it was imposed on public transfers, but not between municipalities or other groups. Then it was kind of imposed on everybody, and now with the new consultation, it looks like it's going to be scrapped. I think initially that was intended to help put more water back into in-stream flows, generally protecting in-stream flows and making the system more adaptive. At the end of the day, given that only about 400 transfers have been approved in Alberta since 2007, and many of those have not really been arm's length, like probably half are actually arm's length deals, the volume of water that's transferred has not been significant enough to add up to significant WCO licenses through the conservation holdback. So I think that was part of the consideration in a group allowing license holders the luxury of not having to lose 10%. Okay, so I was going through the steps. 1 is finding the license, 2 is confirming good standing, 3 is the application, 4 is the request for information. Then there's a mandatory public notice. Usually that is a required publication in a newspaper or other media source in the area. And then there's a 30-day period during which anyone who thinks they might be affected can submit questions or concerns. After that 30-day period, the applicant would respond to those statements of concern. Not very clear how much Alberta Environment participates in that response process, or the applicant, or what the standard is. That's an interesting sort of question in my head. I should know. I've done this a million times, but it's never clear how much of that burden falls to each. But then the director has the discretion to also request a public meeting, which could mean an opportunity to dig a bit deeper into some of those issues that have been raised with statements of concern. And then another additional period for submission. And then, sometimes then following all that, there are additional requests for information, and then finally a decision. I do notice that in the water engagement study, it looks like they'll be putting some cap on the number of requests for information, which I'm sure all license transfers are interested in seeing. But, a request for information could include 50 questions or 2. So I don't know that having fewer requests for information opportunities will necessarily change the quantity of information required. So that's short form of how the water transfer system.
So I'm hearing really it's going to come down to proponents on the landscape and how to have adult conversations around water should that emergency emerge. Well, and it is here, as you said, Arlene. Bob, did you have any last questions?
No, just to say thank you very much. This has been very informative and an excellent conversation, the kind of thing that Jenny likes to do on the Gravity Well.
Thank you. Any final thoughts from the two of you? Anything we missed that you wish we would have asked?
Oh, there's so many interesting things we could have dug into and made subsequent podcasts, but I think this will be great. And I think this might be a useful tool for many people entering the space, because I feel like often in the water area, people are really focused on their lane, irrigation districts on all the subordinate rights they issue and their issues, me in the transfer space, and then Arlene very much focused on the legal framework. And there aren't that many forums that bring all the different voices together. And I think if I were taking a job at Alberta Environment or something, I might think this would be a good podcast to listen to.
That's great. And yeah, you're absolutely right. That's certainly something I experienced in the fossil fuel industry as well, just how little a geophysicist understands the impact that we have in terms of liability, creating emissions, water use, harms to the landscape. All of this stuff is very compartmentalized in our work, and we don't see a lot of that. So this has been a tremendous learning for me since my eyes have been open to it. So you're right. I think the more that we do this in collaborative spaces, the more that people will understand how much we're interrelated and interdependent. Thank you. I really appreciate your time, especially going over. This has been amazing. And yes, I'm imagining we're going to have another conversation. So thank you so much. I'll take care of you.